You're about to enter a new dimension where boundaries of life sciences, data, and technology blur, and AI reshapes what's possible. Welcome to the Improzone, powered by Improzo.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Improzone. We are having a really special mini series of podcast episodes here. This is the middle. This is episode 2. So if you haven't heard episode 1, it might be worth going back and listening. This is really looking at the arc of customer relationship management software with our very own Jason Harlander. And so the first episode gives you the history of where we've been. And then today in episode 2, we're planning to talk a little bit about the current state of affairs, which, as we know, is a little bit tricky and messy. So this is this moment of decision making for many to think about Salesforce versus Veeva. So I'm going to let Jason introduce himself again, just for those of you who maybe had a break between episodes. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. So hello again, everybody. So I'm Jason Harlander. I'm the Executive Director of Technology Management here at Improzo. I am very interested in this space. I've been in this space for 15 plus years, and my big claim to fame is early Veeva employee, like 33. I've been in this industry. I understand what's going on, and I'm excited to get back into this.
Yeah. And this episode is really about the current state of affairs, which we led up to in the last episode. So, where a lot of people are sitting today, right, is figuring out what to do with their current tech stack. Because as we talked about in the last episode, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here is like the
Right.
theme. You have to try something else.
You have a
And it
hard
has to
deadline.
be, yep, and you have a hard deadline. And actually the clock is really ticking because last year
It
is
is.
when Veeva stopped updating your old Veeva. And it doesn't help that it's Veeva Vault CRM. I think that's a little confusing for folks getting used to that terminology. But because Veeva Vault and Veeva CRM in some people's minds are two different things, but
Very different things.
all one thing. Let's set a bit of a scene here around where we are. So if you're in a mid-sized pharma company and you're trying to figure out what to do about your CRM, what are you really choosing between? What's the decision set, Jason?
Yeah, so I think the honest answer is it's really more competitive than it's been, right? As we talked in the last episode, Veeva grabbed a lot of market share, like 80%. So the bulk of the industry, it was Veeva, right? You have some smaller niche players, but the choice was pretty easy. But now, as you mentioned, there's a hard deadline. So a choice has to be made. And for most pharma, mid-sized pharma, large pharma, really your choice is Veeva or Salesforce. And so on the one side, you've got Veeva Vault CRM, which is the new version of what's been really the dominant platform in pharma for 15 years, right? But the change is now it's running on Veeva's proprietary Vault platform. So I think what some people in the industry might not realize is that Vault for Veeva is a platform. Everybody thinks of Vault as like their content management system, but Vault is really the platform that all of Veeva's products besides CRM is built on. So you're talking about all their regulatory products, their clinical products, it's all Vault. So now on the other side, you have Salesforce, right? You have Life Sciences Cloud. It's the new person in the room, but it's backed by some industry heavyweights. Salesforce isn't coming into this not knowing what they're doing. They have a partnership with IQVIA. They've pulled some heavyweights from the industry to help build this. They've got some early customers, and it's generally available. And both sides have made big investments here. And I think this is the actual good thing for the pharma industry. I think that you're going to see a lot of innovation and a lot of new features that could really help the industry because you have the two competing now, right? The big buzzword, and of course here at Improzo it is too, is AI, right? And Veeva and Salesforce both have AI stories now, right? So Veeva launched its own AI agents back in December of last year that cover pre-call planning, content review, voice input. But Salesforce really came out of the gate swinging, right? They rebranded their whole life sciences suite as Agentforce for life science with agentic AI for scheduling and call planning and next best action and insights. So from a future marketing standpoint, you think of this as like a coin flip, like which way do we go? And it's an interesting question and what to look at, right? Veeva still holds a large market share. And I think as of early 2026, 9 of the top 20 pharmas have committed to Vault CRM. We've got some big names there like Novo Nordisk, GSK, Merck. But Salesforce has about 3 of the top 20. And then I looked at some recent studies, and Pharma Voice did a poll and found that 40% of pharma plans to stick with Salesforce versus 25% for Veeva. So I think that what companies need to look at is what does their footprint look like, right? If you are already fully ingrained in Veeva and using all of their other products, it might make an easy decision that we're going to stick with Veeva, but it gets a little murkier if you have an existing larger Salesforce footprint, whether it's on the marketing cloud side or services cloud or other parts of their business that now are suddenly weighing in on how do we consolidate. So,
When you also have Health Cloud, some folks
right,
are using that for their patient data.
correct.
So you've got a
Yeah,
few different products that were already pretty well established for many pharma companies. And that's another component of this is what do you already have that you're going to have to repurpose or retool
right.
to make it work. But I love what you said at the beginning is I think this is an important note because I think as someone who spent a lot of time on the industry side,
Yeah,
the cynical view I took was this is just now a big money pit for pharma companies. We have to pay money to move software. It's
yeah.
frustrating. And I think that's true. It is
It is
actually going to
true.
cost
Yeah,
money. But it also is a good point that I hadn't really thought about, which is that competition and some strength in having multiple players in the
mm,
same space inherently does be a tide that lifts all the boats. So everybody's keeping each
correct.
other on their toes and keeping innovation coming and nobody gets too comfortable. So you end up with overall better choices, better software, better solutions. And so
Right.
that's important to keep in mind as much as this is probably, and it is frustrating to have to make changes to existing things that were not necessarily broken. It's helpful to think about where this could go. And we'll actually, the third episode of our series, we'll get into exactly where we think things are going based on what we're
Yeah,
seeing. But I think that's an important point. Like the scene is messy, but it's also promising because we have these
right.
new tools, new solutions coming our way. So I think one very practical question I would ask you, since you've seen some of this up close, is when you talk to teams who just recently made a call and they were going to
Mm.
move forward with one or the other, what ended up being the decision point that like helped them make the call to move to Salesforce or Viva? Either way, what was the tipping thing?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? And I think it's different for every pharma company. But something to look at is really that I've heard is like platform depth across the enterprise is really a factor. And it works actually both for Salesforce and Viva. When companies realize how much of their R&D, their regulatory, their quality infrastructure is already running on Vault, switching CRM can suddenly look like a much bigger lift than the CRM migration alone. Companies, they're not just changing the tool their reps use, they're potentially like fragmenting a platform that your clinical and regulatory teams rely on.
Right.
So it's a broader question, but to go onto the Salesforce side, right? Takeda, right? They made an announcement in early 2025, and they were the big public example of the Salesforce case. And from what was released, it was they picked Life Sciences Cloud for customer engagement for some of the AI functions around medical, commercial, and patient. And the logic around it was really building a connected AI driven engagement. And they were really betting on Salesforce's broader platform and data infrastructure rather than Viva's side where they have the vertical depth. So
Right.
that's
Right.
that's you can look at it both ways. And Takeda, I mean, they're top 10 pharma and they have the resources and the IT maturity to absorb that kind of bet.
Yeah. And I think Takeda is also having
From the
spent 7
mid-side
years
company,
there. The
no,
thing with Takeda is that it's also a company that tends to want to think in the longer term way. So that makes sense. That also tracks because they're looking, I think from what I remember reading in the press releases, they're looking at the next 10 years, right? Where do we want to place
right,
our bet? And so in their minds, at least, they felt like Salesforce maybe was a better pick for the longer term. And so that's another factor that's interesting for companies to consider is just the company's health and longevity and
right,
durability. That may not play at all for some other companies that are smaller and maybe may not exist in 10 years. They're like in a different headspace around
right.
durability, strength of a company's resources in the long run. They may just be more focused on the next 3 or 4 years to launch their very first product or whatever it is. So it definitely
Well,
the durability factor is not relevant in some cases, but super relevant for some of the bigger firms for sure.
and I think from the mid-sized companies, right? I like what you said, like where from a Takeda standpoint, they have the resources and they're betting on 10 years, right? But mid-sized companies sometimes can't make that same call. And I think that's where this gets a little murkier because the switching cost to move, even if they replaced only the CRM, but if they're using Viva for other applications, it makes it a lot more murkier. And I think
Yeah.
that something that I don't know if everybody looks at, but there's an inherent cost here that you mentioned, right? And while it might feel like a money grab, there's not just the cost of the migration from Veeva or Salesforce to move to CRM, there's also the whole ecosystem of integration vendors that you're using. So whether that's your MDM or your content partners or whatever it may be, you might have
Right.
one, two, but I've worked with some mid-sized pharmas that are using 10 plus vendors, right? And this migration cost gets a lot bigger, and it also gets a lot more complicated, right? Because you not only have to line up timeframes and cost with just Veeva or Salesforce, you have to line this up from a project perspective across all of your integration vendors. So it's not an easy choice, but I think that you have to do that understanding and have an assessment of what is your CRM today? What are your integration vendors and other platforms you're using, whether it's across Salesforce or Veeva? And then understand what you're looking at for the next, I'd say 3 to 10 years, depending on where you're at as a pharma company, to
Right.
really make an educated choice.
That makes sense. And I think there's also this element of unexpected maybe costs, like those like
Mhm.
sneaky fees that come
Yeah,
along when you make these moves, because I think most people are focused on the initial transition cost for the CRM itself or the vault component
right.
itself, which is obviously each of those has a cost. But you were mentioning like there's this sort of bunch of upstream components that feed in that need to be repiped and rebuilt, and then downstream things that consume whatever you're creating in vault or CRM that need to be able to absorb and use the output of your CRM and your vault. So I think that important kind of like comprehensive look at the cost and making sure you didn't miss any big ticket components that might slow you down or cause you have a surprise. It's kind of remodeling a house, right? Like
Yeah,
you get
right.
started and then stuff keeps happening and you're like, oh no, it's now it's twice as much as I thought it was going to be. I think that's an important call out to make sure people are actually looking at not just the software they're changing out, but also the other upstream and downstream components that all fit together. And depending on how mature or complex that is, it could obviously be a sizable transition. The other thing we were talking about before when we were kind of getting ready for this podcast was the user experience change
Mhm.
management piece, which I think is important and certainly does seem to play a strong role, especially for the CRM sales rep experience, knowing that reps are already not real big fans of logging calls. What's the right way to think about that piece of the puzzle as you're doing a transition? Because I think as you were talking, there's extremes, right? In terms of how much change and maybe to a certain extent, how do you leverage that as like a moment to do something different with your field teams if you are considering making a change because you have to. So talk maybe a little bit about the
Right.
change management side of it.
Yeah, so this is where having a real lived experience matters more than what you're getting from the vendors, right? And it's honestly where I think Viva has an advantage, right? That doesn't get enough credit. Viva CRM on the iPad, right? That's been the standard for pharma reps for over a decade, right? And now Salesforce Life Sciences Cloud, they've achieved a competitive mobile and offline parity, and they've invested significantly in offline capabilities to match Viva. But there's still a meaningful difference in how that upgrade can feel to a rep, right? So a Vault CRM migration, for instance, for a team that's already on legacy CRM, it's largely familiar territory. The interface, the workflows, the way it works on the iPad is exactly the same. And I think that's where Viva did this, is that for your actual field reps, there's no change management. The upgrade, you can use it from a day one usage standpoint, and it'll feel like, how Viva CRM has felt for the
Yeah.
last decade. Now, where it's different, and this is where the change management play comes in, and there's a cost there, is for any reps or departments or business units that have to work online. So
Yeah.
maybe your management teams, your MSLs, the online experience is going to be different because, again, we're moving to Vault. We're not on force.com anymore. So it's going to be a different experience. And so there is some training, and there's going to be that change management piece that you have to take into account because it is going to be a different experience for them. But then Salesforce, however, is a different ask altogether. They have a really strong, powerful, and flexible platform, but it requires more deliberate change management
Right.
because field reps who've been on Viva for years, it's different. It's different across the board. But something that I think that from a pharma company perspective to look at is we were asking the same thing of reps 10, 15 years ago when Viva came into the industry,
Right.
right? It was
Right.
different. It was new, and we managed, and it was for the better, right? So while yes, there is a bigger change management flip for Salesforce, I think it is very manageable. And I
Yeah.
think to tie it back to, I think we've got a really great opportunity in the industry now because now we have these two heavyweights that are going to drive change and drive new features. And it may be that Salesforce will come out with this killer feature that Veeva doesn't have, and that might drive some decisions. So I think really seeing where everything lands is a good thing. But like I said, change management, definitely something that companies need to look for when they are looking at this. And I think one thing that I tell any commercial ops leader that's looking at this decision is don't let your IT team own this decision by themselves. Your change management, it has to sit with your commercial, with your sales ops, with your MSL teams. And really, those are the teams that are going to have to live with this choice every day. And they're often the last ones consulted. It's good to make sure that you have ownership across this decision because it does affect so many teams.
Oh, that makes sense. And I do think it's a good call out that change isn't inherently is hard, but it's not inherently worse or bad to make a change.
Right.
So the notion of saying we only can go with Veeva because we don't want to change the user experience might be short-sighted, right? In the longer run,
Right.
just to make sure you're truly comparing the two. So what do you think are some of the misconceptions that companies have when they're trying to make this choice? What have you heard or seen so far?
Yeah, so I've heard the first thing I've heard is we'll decide when we're ready. And I've seen this before when there's hard deadlines. Like the 2030 deadline sounds distant, but it's really not. When you're talking about this like project to do the migration between validation, data migration, retraining, integration work, it can take anywhere from on a smaller scale, maybe 6 months, and on a larger scale, you can go 18 to 24 months for some larger pharma, right? Depending on how many downstream integrations and what you're dealing with, right? So if you're not actively planning now or at least having the conversation, you're already behind, right?
Yeah.
I can say like you can't really address problems after the fact in life sciences, like you have to address them in the now. And I think the other misconception that I've been hearing is that a lot of companies are treating this more as a technology decision rather than a business and people decision, right? So both platforms, they are technically capable. The biggest differentiator is not really features because they both pretty much have feature parity, but it's really how the platform fits overall in your operating model, your field structure, compliance requirements, and also your integration footprint, right? So
Yeah.
if you lead with a platform demo and pick based on what works best or what you're comfortable with, it could have, painful downstream implications, right? And then the third factor is if you're already running Vault, right? If you're running on Vault, right? If your clinical ops, your regulatory submissions, your quality management, your content is all on Vault, your effective switching cost for moving to Salesforce is multiples of what the CRM migration alone, would
Right.
suggest, right? The platform's designed to be an integrated stack, and breaking one piece of it out has consequences that won't show up in an RFP, right?
Yeah. And I think they're
Um,
often very separate groups of people looking at these two pieces of
correct.
software too, right? So it's not like the
Yep.
same team tends to huddle up and work together all the time. So you really have this very disparate two cohorts of people when you think
Right.
about the R&D group versus the commercial group. And it is tempting to think of them as two choices, but they're really integrated to each other.
And I think the other thing is to tie back to the big buzzword, right, is AI, right? Both Viva and Salesforce are pushing aggressive AI messaging right now, right? Viva launched its AI agents last year, but Salesforce has Agent Force. And it's not really a question of who has a better AI story, but what is actually in production and what's been validated for like the regulated environment and who's actually using it and who's seeing measurable outcomes. And I don't
Right.
know if we've gotten that answer from either vendor yet, but it's something to consider because the marketing push on both of them right now is huge.
And it's new on every front. So it's still kind
Right.
of to be tested, to be verified. So I guess one final question before we leave it with the current state and move on to the future. If you are talking to someone who's in like a growth stage biotech and they are in the phases of choosing a CRM and choosing whether they're going to install like Viva Vault CRM or Salesforce, so they don't have a history, so they really are just entering this fray new. What are some of the things that they should be thinking about, and what advice would you give them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, what you should focus on is looking at your trajectory and where your company's going, not just what's current and what your current headcount and size is. I think the Viva entry point for early stage companies has gotten more accessible. And I think that's playing a part in these early biotechs. Viva Basics was introduced in 2024. It's a pre configured, pre validated suite of Vault applications with zero implementation and zero maintenance cost, right? And I think by the end of last year, more than 100 emerging biotechs have adopted Viva Basics. That's big, right? And the
Yeah.
pitch from Veeva was been that you can deploy quickly, you can operate on industry best practices from day one without a full platform migration. You can do that when you're ready, right? But here's the part that I think that doesn't get said enough is that the stickiness of that entry point is a feature and almost a bug if you want to look at it simultaneously, right?
Yeah.
Because once you're running Vault Basics for all your clinical ops, regulatory, and quality, and your team's trained on it, and your processes are validated against it, your documents live in it, your CRM choice on the commercial side is going to start leaning heavily towards Vault CRM almost by default.
Right.
That's not necessarily wrong, but you should choose that more in a conscious way rather than not just because it's the path of least resistance.
And
So
you usually start with clinical, right? That's how
that's where
companies,
you
they don't have a
start.
commercial arm yet. So you're going to basically make a decision for a future non-existent commercial organization. Is there something on the Salesforce side? Are they trying to catch up there to try to position themselves
Well,
for
I
these?
haven't heard if they're starting to catch up, but I wouldn't be surprised if they don't. So there, again, this divorce between the two of them has really opened both of them to go into the market how they
Mhm.
like. So my actual real world advice is really before you sign anything, before you make a decision, pressure test, a few things, right? What's your data complexity look like, right? How messy is your current HCP universe, your territory structure, your sample management? And then the next piece to look at is your compliance requirements, right? Are you operating in markets where the regulatory requirements for interactions are really stringent? And then third, like your overall model, right? Are you building a traditional rep force, MSL heavy, or a hybrid, right? Answering these questions can really narrow the field faster on Veeva or Salesforce. And really, one more thing, I think the way you can navigate this the best is if you bring in someone who's done it before, right? Not just to implement, but to help them ask the right questions before they commit,
Yeah.
because that can make a huge difference, right? These Salesforce and Veeva will only do so much as part of the migration, but typically you need a vendor that can come in and help you manage and ask the right questions between them and make sure that you have your upstream and downstream integration vendors aligned and that the project stays on point. So that would be my recommendation.
No, that's really helpful. And clearly there's no easy answer to this. It's a
There's not.
challenge. But maybe that's just what we need to be honest with ourselves about. This is
Right.
tricky and it requires some careful planning and thought. And you can't start too early thinking about it too. It sounds like, because I know already the clock is ticking and 2030 is
Right.
just not that far away. It's coming fast. The situation your company is in is really like the key factor. Unfortunately, we can't just put one path and be like, everybody do this and
Right.
it'll work. And the next topic, which I think is even more, in some ways, even more exciting than the past and the present, is where are we going with this and how do you
Yeah.
actually get ahead of the CRM? So stay with us because we're going to do another episode where we really talk about the future state. Jason, you want to get the last word?
Yeah, no, thanks, Shane. I think just to end on one thing that we've found at Improzo is that companies who are navigating this best aren't just asking the question of which platform, they're asking of how do we get the most out of whichever one we choose. And that's something where we can come in as Improzo, but I'm very much looking forward to our next conversation and continuing this.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks everyone for listening. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
This has been the Improzone, improving life, empowering customers. Follow us and stay tuned for what's next.